Good morning, everyone. Good morning from the East Coast of the United States. This is Danny Dhaiphong for another episode of The Left Lens. Thanks so much for joining me this morning. We have a very special guest interview today. I'm very excited about this. While you're coming on, make sure that you are liking this video, sharing this video, of course, subscribing if you're new to the channel, hitting the notifications bell so you know when I'm coming on. And the best way to support this work is at Patreon, patreon.com/Danny Dhaiphong, because as we will probably get into, the state of journalism, the state of analysis, political analysis has become a very difficult terrain. So we're just going to get right to it. Okay, so I am pleased to welcome to the program award-winning documentary filmmaker and journalist John Pilger. John, you are someone I have followed for quite a long time. I was so honored that you were able to give a blurb to my co-authored book back in 2019. Your films on Venezuela, War on Democracy, and the coming war on China were hugely influential in my political development as a journalist and an analyst and an activist. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, it's a pleasure, Danny. Pleasure indeed. Thank you.
So let's get right to it with regards to, I've been covering a lot about China, U.S. relations, U.S. escalations with China. Your film, The Coming War on China, was about 6 years ago now when it was released. And a lot of your coverage was 2015 and prior. So it's been about 7 years since that film was released. And we've seen a host of escalations under Obama, then Trump, and now Biden. The recent most, I think, talked about one was Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, backed by military aircraft, naval forces. Do you want to comment on, what are your thoughts now after you produced that film and how things have transpired between the U.S. and China since then?
Well, I remember clearly when I was writing the title, and I scribbled down The Coming War on China and handed it to my producer, and he said, "Oh, that's too extreme. No, we've got to come in gentler than that. That's provocative." I said, "It's meant to be provocative because that's what's happening." So that was 2016. The year Trump was elected, it was several years after Obama had announced the so-called pivot to Asia, the build-up of the greater strength of U.S. naval shipping in the Pacific ever. The arming and rearming of some 400 bases, US bases, which then, and do today, of course, surround China from Australia all the way up through the Pacific, South Pacific, Marshall Islands, across to the Philippines, up to Thailand, Korea, Japan, Okinawa, of course, part of Japan, is practically an entire US base with weapons such as the Aegis guided missiles aimed at the industrial heartland of China. I mention this in some detail because you never hear what I've just said on the news. Who knows that China is ringed by such aggressive military American presence? All we've had for the last few years is China making something out of the Spratly Islands, which are barely islands, and in fact building defense airstrips to these bases. So that's when I began to make the film. And since then, of course, the provocation has not been in the title of my film. The provocation has all come from the United States. I remember somebody in Shanghai, an academic with close ties to the government, saying, "Do you really want us to be an enemy?" Because he was mentioning you regarding the West, because if you do, you're going about it very, very quickly. So I would think that it's changed completely the general mood. There was a kind of almost a benign mood in China then. There isn't now.
Right. Right. No, so much has happened since then. And, you mentioned that there's this ring of military bases. You described it in the film as a noose around China. And
described that way by somebody in the State Department really took me aback. Somebody who I didn't think would barely open his lips to me. And he came out with this. It's our noose.
wow. Yeah. But all we hear about is China being the aggressor. And what do you think about this narrative of China being the aggressor? Because I feel like that's all we hear in the Western media, that there isn't any deviation from that line. And as you said, there's a complete media blackout about what the United States is doing militarily in that region to provoke China.
Well, Danny, the way you described that's all we hear, as you rightly say, that is indeed all we hear, that China is the aggressor. But that can be applied to all the accredited enemies of the United States, and I suppose of the West, its vassals. And so again, we're banging our heads against this wall of a one-sided perception, a one-sided media. It's not as if we take one side ourselves in particular, but the perception is so warped. I'm broadening this because it's something that almost stops our argument that the one-sidedness of, and we're talking about basically media here because they are the purveyors of this distorted, mutated perception. China is not an imperial country. It has its own sphere of influence. It's a vast country with a large number of people, but it has no interest in being a 19th century country like the United Kingdom or the United States. Its interest is clear, and it's clear to most people in the world what it wants to do. It wants to develop itself and to put in the past the grinding poverty and suffering that its people went through for hundreds of years. That's what China is. And the very notion of our creating this enemy to be provoked, to be threatened, to the point where the enemy, as I understand it, has changed its nuclear posture from low alert to high alert. It's building up its army quickly. It's diverting much of its extraordinary technological power into the military. It wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't threatened.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in the media, we hear it's just aggression for aggression's sake, and I think that takes us to something else. You mentioned there's a litany of adversaries, enemies that the United States has created, the West has created, and one of which is Russia. And right now, there's been an unprecedented amount of censorship, right?
Yeah.
Especially about international media, Russian media, Chinese media, in the wake of this ongoing now 6 months of Russia's military intervention in Ukraine. I'm wondering, what are your reactions 6 months into this, given all that has happened in Ukraine, globally, and its impact on the work that that you do and that we do?
Well, I think it's tragic. It needn't have been. I would go back to last December when Vladimir Putin declared a proposal to the West. Unusually, he made it public for us all to read, a proposal for a security compact in Europe. I read this very carefully. It seemed to make a lot of sense to me. Negotiable, of course, highly negotiable. But there it was, a proposal to settle the disputes, to once and for all build some kind of security around Europe, a continent that has known such bloodshed in my lifetime, and in the way that that the whole post-Second World War notion of never again has been forgotten completely. And here we had NATO forces, in effect, up to the western borders of Russia, the very border where Hitler's armies invaded in 1941, I think, yes, 1941, resulting in some 23 million Russians killed. Anybody who's ever been to Russia and has taken the trouble to visit some of the extraordinary cemeteries, such as the one in St. Petersburg, which pays tribute to those who fought for what was then called Leningrad during the Second World War. I sat in there, I remember, a whole day as Shostakovich played over this cemetery. I've never seen anything like it. The numbers lost as the Russians fought for their lives against the Nazis is felt right through that nation today by young people as well. Not by all of them, but by enough young people that, in a way, that history is a presence. So that's the context for this tragic and invasion of that Russia, that Putin invaded. You shouldn't invade a sovereign country like Ukraine. It's wrong. But it was, I think I've never seen the last resort invoked with such historical evidence to back it, almost justification. That doesn't mean to say that one approves it, but the best way of describing it is a tragedy. But there is a truth about what's happened over the last 6 months. You asked, Danny, you believe nothing in the Western media, and I don't say that as a bit of agitprop or something. You just don't believe anything. You learn to deconstruct that media that you might be able to get something from. There's no mainstream media in this country, Great Britain, that I would trust, and I can't think of any in the United States that I would trust. But what I seem to have gleaned is that it's quite different from what we're told over and over again, which of course is very familiar war propaganda, that Russia probably has completed what it needs and what it set out to do, and that is take control of the Donbass, the Russian-speaking Donbass region, which was under constant assault from 2014. Take control of that and to secure Crimea. Now, there is one problem, huge problem here, and that is that the United States has effectively declared itself at war with Russia. The defense secretary, I think at a NATO meeting in Poland, said that America's aim was to wear down, I can't remember the exact words, but that's, I paraphrase it, wear down, in fact, destroy the Russian Federation. So, and the amount of arms, billions of dollars worth of arms, much of it ending up, of course, on the Ukrainian, the infamous Ukrainian black market where a lot of things end up. That too. But American arms pouring in, Ukrainian troops are trained in this country, in Britain. They're trained by American officers. Ukraine was once described as a CIA theme park. All right, perhaps an exaggeration, but not too much. So that means that the two great nuclear superpowers are facing each other. That could go beyond tragedy and become really dangerous.
Yeah, indeed, it could very well become dangerous. What you describe is a permanent war. I mean, and that's it's usually Russia being described again, just like China, as the aggressor, And in this case, yes, Russia did invade, but it's the United States and its NATO partners that are keeping this going on. And you mentioned December, that there was a possibility to prevent any of this from happening. And the United States and NATO both simultaneously said absolutely not. So when we say this, though, we're often derided, and this is the McCarthyism. I want to ask you about this, because there's this kind of McCarthyist atmosphere that it has been developed over the course of the last 6 months, or I should say intensified, because this has been years in the making. But I mean, what do you have to say about those who deride what just the context that you provided as being kind of like a propagandist for Russia and sort of justifying this invasion and honestly, this really, what I think is an exaggeration, right? The most impactful or destructive war that we've seen in the region since World War II.
Oh. Well, actually, the last one was NATO's illegal assault on Yugoslavia when it blew Yugoslavia to bits. That was probably more destructive in a sense, but then since then, of course, NATO played a part in the invasion of Iraq, in which 1 million people, as a result of which 1 million people died. The invasion of and destruction of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, which unleashed jihadism throughout the region. So this is really just par for the course, as golfers say. This is what NATO does. It's not even to be critical of it. It's a factual description of NATO and its aggression. Every time that terrible man who is the so-called Secretary General, a Norwegian called Jens Stoltenberg, opens his mouth, he salivates almost as a warmonger. This in 2022, in the continent that lost millions of people, the continent of the Holocaust, the continent of such destruction that has never been seen before, it is just astonishing. And going back to what I mentioned, the Russian proposals were the first. They were a draft. They were obviously for the United States, but for Europe as well, for the European Union. Here you are, this is what we propose. to prevent war, to somehow keep our continent peaceful, to see that that World War II does not happen again. And they were dismissed. They were mocked. I would have thought that anybody, a regular media consumer, certainly in this country, and certainly in the United States, wouldn't even know they existed. And right up to, when was it, February the 24th, that Russian troops went into Ukraine, the provocation continued. We had Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, I think at a meeting in Germany, threatening nuclear weapons. He doesn't have nuclear weapons, but his adversary, Russia, does, and threatening a nuclear war. I mean, the recklessness. But then, Danny, this is history. Go back to the beginning of the First World War, the recklessness that was a precursor to every major war in modern times, is just being repeated again. This insults our collective intelligence completely.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to ask you, before transitioning to the subject of Julian Assange, I think it's all related. What is your take on where you think this is going, both with Russia and China? Because it's not often talked about like this. And I think for the reasons that we've mentioned in terms of just the Western mainstream media, just not talking about this at all. And when they do talk about these two countries and their dealings with them, it's China and Russia as the aggressor. But obviously what we pointed out is that the US and NATO are encircling these two countries. And NATO, of course, in their last their last gathering said that China's malicious, and now they're on the agenda as well. So NATO is really expanding that transatlantic region that it has moved past, as you mentioned, in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. But I wanted to ask you, where do you think this is going? Because, I mean, there are real concerns of nuclear exchange, obviously, because in NATO's so-called constitution, if we can call it that, it says that whenever a country that is in NATO is so-called threatened, that all countries are to, are to become involved. And the United States is a nuclear power that has used it. And we can't say the same about anyone else, but Russia and China particularly.
Well, they say a lot. NATO are a bunch of loudmouths, and they have been for a long time. And their ridiculous so-called constitution, their self-given powers, as if they have taken these from some divinity somewhere. They have no legal remit across our lives, but they are exercising one, and it is one of aggression. Their history is aggression. It is not. It is about armies preparing for war. It is not about considering treaties, considering truces. The safest period was probably seen as one of the most dangerous, and that's when the great treaties were signed between the Soviet Union and the United States. I interviewed a number of the American negotiators, extraordinary men like Paul Warnke, intelligent, conservative in their own political worldview, perhaps, but civilized, intelligent, none of them wanting to even go near the touch paper of nuclear war. They've all gone. I mean, they've gone literally, but there's there's no one to replace them. We have a problem with the United States. The world has a US problem. The US basically occupies a kind of international mad dog role, and it has from its very early days one of aggression, either aggression south, aggression towards its own indigenous people. It's always aggression. So there has to be quite a few of the poor Warnkies, the sane men, the trusted people, to draw back, to restrain this almost historical force, I have to say, that is in the United States. The self-belief in ridiculous myths about itself, the ignorance about the rest of the world, the almost unhinged hatred of Russia. Russia, of course, are a bunch of Bolsheviks still. In fact, I watched the other day two so-called distinguished American journalists. What's his name? One was Gross, I think. Good name, if that's it. From National Public Radio, debating with some guy from the New York Times, and they both declared that that Russia was communist, until it was pointed out to them that Russia was no longer communist. Far from it. The Communist Party was a minority party in Russia. But it struck me, I wouldn't have taken this, wouldn't even noted this, but here is NPR, National Public Radio, New York Times, the most respected newspaper in the United States and possibly one of the worst, expressing such ignorance at this dangerous time. That's what I mean by the world has an America problem.
Yeah, and I think that it's appropriate to talk about now Julian Assange, because Julian Assange's work was kind of the antidote to this America problem, to be able to expose the lies, the war crimes, right, the deception of the Western media in such a profound way, such an impactful way, to the point where the entire mainstream media, not many people remember this, but the mainstream media had to pay attention to Assange's work deeply, right, in that early period, 2011, 12, because of just how damning the indictments were and the evidence was of U.S. war crimes. You've been working with Julian Assange, around Julian Assange's case since the beginning, and could you comment on where things are at? I know that the order was given, that extradition is on the table. I know that there's a lot of complicated legal proceedings from here. And we found out so many different things about how the CIA was spying on journalists, people, maybe perhaps yourself, as you were talking to Julian Assange, right? Just in order to keep him where he is at right now, which is imprisoned without committing any kind of crime, for what I can gather. What are your reactions to where things are at now with regard to Julian Assange, given all that we've just talked about, the dangers of this misinformation and this threat of perhaps one of the biggest, most consequential number of wars to come when it comes to Russia and China?
But Julian is terribly important. It's a hideous case of injustice, and the toll on Julian himself as the center of this injustice is just terrible. But it's also emblematic of the very thing that we've been talking about. WikiLeaks broke the silence of the media. You know, we talked at the beginning about, again, this is the perception. We have to always mention this distorted perception that comes from media. Well, WikiLeaks broke through that. Yes, as you say in the beginning, the the media, the so-called mainstream, took a great deal of notice of him. His revelations could not be ignored. They were extraordinary. They were, if you like to use the old saying, they were 100 scoops rolled into one. They were telling people what they had a right to know, and they were describing in graphic, authentic detail. That's the point about them. They were authentic. Chelsea Manning's revelations gave us a glimpse of war that I knew about, the 360-degree principle. That is, you kill everything within 360 degrees, regardless of whether it's military or civilian. That principle, so-called principle, has existed since Vietnam. And there it was in Iraq being applied at the time of when the collateral murder video was made showing an US Apache helicopter shooting down people in the street in Baghdad. America's colonial wars have always been homicidal. They've been an extension of a homicidal culture that exists in the United States itself, as we know, week after week, with yet another mass killing. Well, that is simply transferred. It was certainly so in Vietnam. The body count, killing people, whoever they were, was what mattered. Not even winning the thing, killing people. So Julian Assange's WikiLeaks pushed back the screen and presented the truth of this to millions of people. It couldn't be ignored. It was published all over The Guardian in London, most of it in the New York Times, other newspapers all over the world. It was a revelation, followed, and both from Iraq and Afghanistan, followed by the leaking of diplomatic cables that showed how these so-called diplomats think and plan our destinies. It was an extraordinary public service by WikiLeaks. At the same time, of course, it shamed the media because the media had not done anything like this. And so we had the spectacle of, say, papers like The Guardian turning on Assange. And you must remember that they conducted pretty well a decade-long, lots of them did, including the New York Times and other papers, Washington Post, decade-long campaign of vitriol against Assange, mocking the very idea that he was a truth teller, a journalist. And to the point now they are very quiet because it's quite obvious that everything Assange predicted has come true. Even the prediction, possible prediction, that what has happened to him could certainly happen to others. I don't think it'll happen to the New York Times or The Guardian, but it will happen to those journalists who do their job and do something of what he has done. So everything that happens to Julian Assange could not be more important for journalism. That's his crime, of course. He has one crime, journalism. For journalism and for the people who still depend on journalists to tell them how the world works. it is a very complicated judicial process, Danny. It's where it's at the moment. Yes, the Home Secretary here is like the Interior Minister, has given the order for him to be extradited to the United States. Now, if he goes to the United States, he'll be dropped in a maximum security hellhole. He'll have a trial in Virginia, where his grand juries and juries will be made up of government employees and particularly drawn from the security establishment. So he doesn't stand a chance. And the so-called charges, which are under a 1917 legislation called the Espionage Act, add up to him getting 175 years, all for journalism. It's grotesque, absurd, but it's hard to laugh at something like this. It's really grotesque. So keeping him out of the United States has been an aim of the campaign of his lawyers here. Very difficult because all governments allied, so-called, with the United States or in league with the United States have colluded with them, including the government of Julian's own country, Australia. It colluded with the United States instead of protecting its citizen. I can't think, frankly, of another injustice, another miscarriage of justice as great as this. So where we are at the moment is that the lawyers, Julian's lawyers, have submitted to the High Court their response to the Home Secretary's extradition order, which takes the case if the High Court accepts it. If it does, it takes it back into the High Court, and we begin the whole process again through the High Court in Britain, possibly ending up with the European Court. So who knows where it'll go? I don't know, and I'm not sure the lawyers know. No, we're holding our breath, but the one glimmer of hope is that if the lawyers are allowed to argue on the basis of truth and of what Julian actually did, which was the very antithesis of a crime, then it may be very, very difficult for the High Court to allow the United States, and inevitably another appeal, which the US will make, no doubt. I don't know. So far, the courts in this country have seemed to be an extension of the Department of Justice in Washington. So I'm not optimistic.
Yeah. I mean, nothing up until this point has given us reason to be optimistic. And at the same time, you know, I'm wondering if you could speak to, you know, with Julian Assange, with everything we've spoken about, it's created a very chilling effect, I think, on journalism. And, you know, I consider myself kind of a journalist and an analyst. And, you know, we have a lot of activists here who watch this channel, a lot of journalists, a lot of analysts, or just people who are trying to seek out truth and then also affect change. What would you say to them now in this environment? I mean, you've done more than 50 years of work. You've gone to war zones. You have, you know, you have exposed war crimes yourself, Vietnam, across the world. What would you say to those now who are feeling like the case of Julian Assange, this encirclement of Russia and China, these really scary moments, people holding their breath around Nancy Pelosi's visit, or back in February when Russia intervened, invaded in Ukraine, right? These moments that are frightening, and they always come with a corresponding intensification of this repression and censorship. What would you say to those who are trying to do this work now, in this moment?
Well, there is a small group of people who are doing this work now. They're all on social media. The so-called mainstream media has surrendered. It's part of the problem, as we've discussed. What I would say to them: keep going, please. Be brave. You have to be brave, because now you're being watched. I mean, when a distinguished journalist of my vintage, Patrick Lawrence, finds that he's been very critical of the coverage of Ukraine, finds that his Twitter account is closed down. So I suppose when we're now all using the communications we use are big American corporations, so we can hardly be surprised that some fine websites like Consortium News has been given notice that it is being watched by an organization partly funded by the State Department. I mean, there is now Ministry of Truth, not called that, of course, but might as well be in the Biden administration. They have license now. They feel they have license to move against those that used to be called in the old Soviet Union dissidents. Dissidents. To be a journalist is to be a dissident. Well, I suppose it always was. But the atmosphere today is threatening. No more threatening than for Julian Assange. I don't believe that, as I said, I don't believe that newspapers that are simply voices of the state, unless papers like New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, call themselves free press. They're not the free press, of course. I don't believe they're at risk at all, but journalists who, I won't roll call them here, but there are a small band of brothers and sisters on both sides of the Atlantic, probably mainly in the United States, who keep investigating, who keep telling us the truth. We need them more than ever to keep going.
Yeah. Well, John, this was a really good conversation. I appreciate you taking out your time on the weekend to speak with me. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts. I do want, as you were talking, I was thinking about, Europe. I was thinking about you're in London. Australia is, your place of origin. I wanted to ask you about maybe to close, if you could come. There's a lot of political changes happening. I mean, both countries have experienced a lot of political change in the last several months.
Yeah.
Europe is also very important in terms of what we talked about with Russia, China, and of course Assange, because Australia is doing very little to protect one of its own citizens. Nothing. Do you want to comment on just sort of the state of what's going on in Europe?
Well, the UK is the great imperial state. It gave birth to progenies of the United States. And it produced the colonies all over the world. It produced my own homeland, Australia. It no longer directly runs the empire, though it runs a corporate empire all over the world, a very powerful one. And but it decided that it would be sometimes not an entirely happy number two to the United States, but I think it's settled into that. That's what it is. Australia is a mere vassal. Australia is its politics, its intelligence, its military, its media. Much of its culture is integrated in the United States. So that's what it is. It's basically controlled by the United States. It doesn't matter which government is in. At the moment, there's a Labour government in Australia, which a lot of ever hopeful people thought would make a difference and would do the right thing, as they say there, for Julian Assange, but that hasn't happened. We have corporate governance, imperial corporate governance, and I use that word literally because it is imperial, right throughout the West. Europe is astonishing. Here is this massive power, the source of the most extraordinary technological and cultural advancement without a voice. No voice, weak voice, a timid voice, a compliant voice. I find that amazing. I don't think, the hysteria over Brexit, well, Brexit, yeah, maybe join the European Union for Britain was a bad idea in the first place. I'm not sure about that. But Europe with no voice, that always wary of offending the United States. Although now the voice, of course, in Europe is that rather neurotic voice, and I use that term advisedly, of Eastern Europe. One only has to travel in Eastern Europe and discuss any of this, and there is a visceral hatred in countries like Poland, with great historical of the Soviet Union, the Russians. So with certain justification historically, yes. But it is a neurosis that is now seeping into Europe. I find that very, very worrying indeed. It brings with it a racism towards immigrants, asylum seekers, all the things that Europe was meant to get rid of after its horrific period that ended in 1945. The Second World War, in a sense, hasn't happened, hasn't ended. It's still going. And but I mentioned earlier the sense of history in Russia. The feeling about Nazis and fascists in Russia is a presence. And of course, one of the great propaganda successes about Ukraine is to minimize or extinguish. Sorry, that's my phone.
That's okay.
Well, I was going on a bit too long there, Danny. You want to wait till that?
Yeah, sure. We can.
In a minute.
All right. Yeah, we can wait. I just
Cut it there. I needed to stop.
No worries, no worries. No, you can continue. Surely finish your thought.
Well, one of the issues that has been minimized, if not extinguished, which the Russians feel, they feel it historically and they feel it today, is that of neo-Nazis on their doorstep. And the idea that Ukraine doesn't have any is what much of the media, Western media, has tried to promote. It's ridiculous. It's like saying there's no night, there's no day. They've had it, and they have a history of it. And they have a history of doing the most hideous things to people. That doesn't mean all Ukrainians are like that, or that the political system, or that Mr. Zelensky is one, but he has allies who themselves are fascists. And when Russia has spoken about that, it's almost been speaking with a voice of 1945, been interesting. And there are deaf ears over this side in Western Europe. The Germans have their own reason to be deaf, but not to understand that is a tragedy.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I kept you longer, and I don't want to keep you any longer. Thank you so much for joining me this weekend. I'll stay on, everyone, for another half hour, 40 minutes or so. So please do stick around. But John, thanks so much. We'll definitely be in touch. I appreciate all of your work. And do you want to tell people where they can find you?
Where they can find me? Well, they can go to my Twitter at John Pilger, or my website is johnpilger.com. Beyond that, they won't find me. Okay.
All right, sir. All right. I appreciate you taking the time. Be well. Have a good rest of your day.
Welcome. Thank you, Danny. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. That was a really, really good conversation. Thanks so much, everyone who took the time out to come through. I'm going to cover a story or two, so definitely stick around. Get those likes up. We're still about 100 away from the number of viewers. We got 500 plus people on. Thanks so much for listening to John's work. His analysis, I think, was very prescient at this time. So please do continue to like the video. Of course, I am doing some fundraising. I actually just realized my interface is malfunctioning. So as you can see, there's a little bit of a different setup. The mic is farther away. One of my interface is malfunctioning, so I need to get a new one. And so I'm looking for about $30 per month more on Patreon before the end of this month. It's August 27th, so I can stick to my goal and be able to upgrade, make, this stuff does have a cost to it to keep this going. I also have volunteers. I do want to send some folks money, volunteers who want to help me out with some things. I do want to send them something. So please do subscribe at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong for a monthly amount, or a Substack for an annual amount as well. Please do continue to like the video, though, as well. So, all right, guys, that was a great conversation. I was honored that John Pilger took the time out. It was a great conversation. And I want to follow up. There's a few things I wanted to cover. I'm going to try to cover two. One is the end of Black August is coming. I want to give some love to George Jackson for how influential he was to me. First, though, I want to talk about a development that is very interesting in my eyes. And that is that we have a scenario where as we said, Russia and China are viewed as the aggressors, right? China aggressor Taiwan and the larger Asia Pacific, South China Sea. Russia the aggressor in Ukraine. And what's so interesting about this is that this has come amid what the Western media would have us believe, that both of these countries are isolated. right, that these countries don't have support, especially around these questions of Taiwan and Ukraine. And that because the United States has rallied Europe and NATO, right, that this means that China and Russia are alone, that they are alone in their aggressive, quote unquote, endeavors. Well, what's so interesting about this moment is how, while this multipolar world is being born, we also have an intensification of what I think is this renewed sense of anti-imperialist and anti-colonial resistance to aggression toward Russia and China, that there is more solidarity with Russia and China around the world in places with lots of experience with imperialism and colonialism than the Western media would have you believe. And even US and Western media mouthpieces and even mouthpieces of intelligence agencies are admitting this. And so let's key in on the African continent. In a past stream, I talked about how China's aid to Africa and its finance and industry and economic relationships with Africa are very significant, that China has announced that it will be forgiving 17 African countries' loans, 23 in total, and how this has created, I think, a brotherly, sisterly relationship between China and the vast majority of African nations. And so with Taiwan, right, you have this idea that Taiwan is some kind of independence movement. It's some kind of struggle, right? It's some kind of freedom movement. Well, if that were the case, a freedom movement from an imperialist country, right? Because China is considered imperialist and colonial. If that were the case, you would expect that countries like the vast majority, if not all, in Africa have experienced this colonialism, right, from the West, that they would jump on board with the United States around Taiwan. And they would jump on board with Taiwan and defend Taiwan from so-called Chinese aggression. Well, actually, the opposite is true. So, Voice of America, as you may know, came out of the Board of Broadcasting Governors and is now part of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which, of course, the BBG was founded by the CIA, but became absorbed into a sort of U.S. congressional funding project that now is the a, uh, uh, a U.S. Agency for Global Media. Now it's UGAM. There's a consortium of what used to be entirely intelligence-backed media sources, which I believe they still are, but now they are funded officially through Congress, and Voice of America is one of them. Not a friend of China, but here you have African leaders. It says quick to address U.S.-China tensions over Taiwan. Well, how do they address them? What is their stance? It says a spike in tensions between China and the United States over Taiwan has not gone unnoticed in Africa and has prompted responses that underscore the continent's tilt toward Beijing. The U.S. announced trade talks with Taiwan on Thursday following a U.S. congressional delegation's visit earlier this week that came on the heels of a controversial trip to the self-governing, they say, island by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Washington's interactions with Taipei have infuriated Beijing, leading to military drills by China in the seas around the island. Most countries in Africa have sided with China. During Pelosi's visits, officials from several African countries condemned the U.S. and publicly supported China. This includes the government of Eritrea, which deplored Pelosi's visit as a reckless continuation of U.S. policies marked by flaws and follies. Zimbabwe's ruling party, ZANU-PF, also attacked the U.S. for aggressive conduct following Pelosi's visit, with spokesman Chris Mutsvanga saying it is cardinal postulate of international diplomacy that there is one China and Taiwan is an integral part of the mainland. The foreign minister of the Republic of Congo, meanwhile, expressed firm support for the one China policy, and that China state media was quick to criticize Pelosi's visit and listed all the leaders that supported China. All right. So there's just one example, right? A host of African states say one China policy is internationally recognized, and that these African countries stand with China. And I mean, there are very good reasons for that we've covered here. So China is not isolated on the African continent. China has relationships with all African countries, very important economically, and only one African country, which is newly independent, um, actually supports uh, 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 Taiwan, which is Eswatini. And of course, we have Somaliland, which is not a country, right? You have these kind of nascent. I mean, Eswatini is a kingdom. It's a monarchy, and so it supports Taiwan and has long relations with the KMT going back before the Chinese Revolution, and it's the only country officially recognized by the United Nations that has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. All African countries have diplomatic relations with China and reject the US's increasing escalations over Taiwan. So that's huge. China is not isolated. And maybe that's easier for people to understand, that China is not isolated. It's a little harder to understand this with Russia. And that's because with Russia's military operation, its special military operation, its intervention, invasion, whatever people want to call it, I'm okay with whatever. But with it has come, I think, a delicate political situation for people to navigate. In the West, in the United States, that's been exploited to create a wall-to-wall McCarthyism, which says Russia's the aggressor, and look, they're waging a war, so that means they're the aggressor. And guess what? All of our allies, right, NATO, Europe, they're all on board with us because, as John Pilger said, they are vassals of the United States. And so it looks like Russia is very isolated. But of course, it's much different. If Russia was very isolated, its economy would not be in the situation that it's in, which is actually not too bad of a shape, right? The sanctions against Russia were supposed to cripple its economy, and what it's done instead is cripple Europe's economy. It's crippled the United States' economy. But the ruble is facing a decade-long high, and Russia's economy is quite stable. So that alone shows that Russia is not isolated, because that means it has partners around the world, China being the biggest, but partners all around the world that support it. And here's a good example of that. Friend of the show, Ben Norton. He covered this. Only 4 of 55 African leaders back in June attended a Zelensky call showing neutrality on Russia and Ukraine. So only 55, 93% of the leaders of the African continent refused to attend a phone call with Zelensky. You would think, oh, well, that's not a big deal. Maybe they were all busy. Well, there's a context to this, okay? There's a context to this. And I want to show you that the mainstream media, too, not just Ben Norton, as respectable as his journalism is, it wasn't just him, right? He wasn't the only one saying that Africa and Asia and the rest of the world was having issues with how the United States was in the West were framing this issue, and that they disagreed wholeheartedly with trying to isolate Russia. Here we have in Foreign Policy magazine that this was back in March. So this is back in March 30th, 2022. It's just a month. We're 6 months into this military operation, this intervention, invasion by Russia. 6 months in. This is just in the first month, right? You had Foreign Policy magazine saying the West is with Ukraine, the rest not so much. Africa and Asia's longstanding ties to Russia and resentments against Washington keep them on the fence for now. I mean, as we well know, it hasn't been for now. It has been for good. There has not been any change in this. If there was, we would see a lot different behavior. I'm going to get into that now. But it said that month, United Nations ambassador from South Africa, Matu Joini, took a moment to debate in the UN General Assembly the humanitarian fallout from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to scold the United States for its past military follies, including Iraq. The United States and its Western allies, she suggested, had committed their own violations of the UN Charter and were simply pursuing their geopolitical advantage over Russia by championing UN resolutions denouncing Moscow as an aggressor. Making this point today in our discussion on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is not a form of whataboutery, underscoring the point that many countries and their people suffer the consequences of wars that are not of their own doing, she said. So this statement reflects the challenges the United States faces and continues to face as it seeks to show Russia a unified diplomatic front in support of Ukraine. Besides the United States' closest friends and military allies in the West and East Asia, most of the world is not interested in joining the U.S. campaign to isolate Russia. As outraged as they may be by Russia's land grab in Ukraine, many countries have historical ties to Russia that they are not prepared to abandon, and they fear an economic blockade against Moscow would inflict severe pain on their own countries, fueling higher fuel and food costs and planting the seeds for greater hunger and instability within their own borders. And so there was, of course, the General Assembly voted to denounce the invasion. But what this shows, though, and I think it's important, is that there isn't strong support in Africa, Asia, and Latin America for this opposition, the economic warfare, and the military escalations that the U.S. and Europe, NATO have escalated with Russia. That there isn't much of it. There's no appetite for that, and I mean, there's a good reason why there wouldn't be an appetite for this, right? Because what South Africa's UN ambassador was saying has kind of played out. We've had the United States assert its hegemony, or attempt to assert its hegemony over the sovereignty of African countries by trying to prevent them from doing business with Russia during this time, trying to dictate what African countries can and cannot do. I mean, that sounds like imperialism. And here, I mean, this is all within the last month, where you had the U.S. on a blitz against Africa, trying to tell African countries that they cannot. At first they're saying don't buy the grain, don't do it, don't trade at all, right? Which would be devastating for African countries which need these cheaper imports, right? Because a lot of African countries, despite being so wealthy, are import dependent, and the cost of Russia's imports are a lot cheaper. So here you have, on August 4th, earlier this month, the U.S. saying Africa can buy Russian grain, but risks actions on oil. So African nations are free to buy grain from Russia, but could face consequences if they trade in U.S. sanctioned commodities such as Russian oil, the U.S. ambassador to the UN said on Thursday. So this is Linda Thomas Greenfield, right? This she is a black political imperialist. She says countries can buy agricultural products from Russia, including fertilizer and wheat. But if a country decides to engage with Russia where there are sanctions, then they are breaking those sanctions. We caution countries not to break sanctions because then they stand the chance of having actions taken against them. So this is a direct threat. African countries are being threatened with economic warfare, despite offering nothing in return, nothing as an alternative, threatening African countries with economic warfare, and then claiming China is the imperialist and that Russia is the aggressor and the imperialist. Last time I checked, Russia and Ukraine are at war, but Russia hasn't punished European supporters. It said that we will, reduce oil sales, etc., as a consequence because this is a war. But even still, Russia has maintained economic ties and actually a lot of energy ties throughout this whole period with the U.S. and with European NATO countries. Very few consequences. This kind of threat is, first off, Russia's at war. I mean, Russia and Ukraine are at war. Let's just say it, okay? They're at war. Russia calls it a special military operation, but given the global gravity of what's happened, I mean, this is a war between the two governments. Now, the United States arguably doesn't have the right. I mean, always arguably doesn't have the right to tell African countries what to do. But just even given the status of where it's at, its position, it technically is not at war. But as we know, right, the United States is using Ukraine to fuel a proxy war. So the United States has extended that proxy war globally and is now telling countries that it views as weak, inferior, right? This is the white supremacist imperialist ideology at work. Weak, inferior, poorer, right? It is attempting to say to these countries that no, our dominance, our might is right, and you need to listen. You need to follow our economic policies. You need to follow our military policies. We are international law. Doesn't matter about your interests, your sovereign interests, your national interests, your global politics and foreign policy. They don't matter. This is the definition of imperialism, right? With imperialism, independence, sovereignty, national liberation, the ability to determine your own destiny, self-determination don't matter. The United States' interests are all that matter. And that's what you have here. You have here African countries being blackmailed, being threatened, right? And so Thomas Greenfield was speaking in Kampala in Uganda after a meeting with Yuri Museveni, U.S. ally who has not criticized Russia's invasion of Ukraine and has expressed sympathy with Moscow. So even Museveni, even people who are in the U.S. camp, leaders, are not willing to go along with the U.S. Uganda was the U.S. officials' first stop on an Africa tour, which included visits to Ghana and Cape Verde. Her trip comes a week after Sergei Lavrov, the Russian minister who denounced charges of his country's invasion of Ukraine, is solely responsible for a dangerous food crisis in countries ranging from Somalia to South Sudan. So he blamed the food shortages on the market, in which an absolutely inadequate reaction of the West, which announced sanctions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So there you have it. The United States sanctioned Russia, destabilized the world economy, and is now threatening countries in Africa to follow along with this campaign of sabotage, which will hurt African countries. Africa itself as a continent is in a very precarious position. Imperialism, Western imperialism, US imperialism has looted the continent, has looted it, has kept it poor, has kept it underdeveloped, has maintained neo-colonial relationships. And now the United States is saying, let's worsen that situation for you, and you have to be okay with it, or we will punish you further. I mean, that is thuggery. That is gangsterism. That is what imperialism is. So I don't want to hear about China, Russia being imperialism, being the aggressor, because that's absolutely folly. That's ridiculous. So I wanted to cover that really quickly. There was one other story I wanted to cover, but maybe I'll save it for a different stream. But will China save the world and no one noticed? I will have to get to that article another time, because I do want to cover something that is dear to my heart, okay? And that is George Jackson. We're coming up at the end of Black August, okay? So keep liking the video as I transition into this. Like the video, hit that Oh, look, the ratio is great now. So we are above 500 likes. Thank you so much. Keep sharing the video, of course. And of course, I am at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong, looking to build up more subscribers because I got some things to replace. I want to extend out some monetary compensation for people who are doing some work for me. So please do patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. Look for $30 per month before the end of this month. So $30 per month more. It would be amazing. You can go on Substack as well to support, and there are other ways in the description. All right, so George Jackson, this is dear to my heart. He was assassinated August 21st, 1971 at San Quentin prison. George Jackson's politics, his struggle, his history, very important to me. I wrote a paper in college about Ho Chi Minh. This was before I was writing, I was doing journalism for the school paper and stuff, but senior year of college, I did a paper on George Jackson, Ho Chi Minh. George Jackson called himself the Dragon. He was a fervent reader of Ho Chi Minh's work. And I talked about the international solidarity, internationalism that was expressed between the two through their politics, through their writings, and how that gives us a vision for what true global internationalism, right, looks like from a cage, right? To be able to do that from a cage, because Ho Chi Minh also experienced a period of confinement by the KMT in China, actually. And wrote incredible poems during that time. So I want to talk about George Jackson and, of course, Black August, not just in commemoration of him, but it's in August because his assassination occurred at that time. We also had a couple, a few weeks earlier, his younger brother, who was barely out of high school age, I don't even think he was out of high school age. He was a teenager, attempted to free him and others with him. And so, George Jackson wrote a couple of books, Soledad Brother, Prison Letters, which are great, but my favorite is Blood in My Eye, which I highly suggest. And his politics were very influential. So I want to read an article that I wrote for Black Agenda Report a long time ago now, I guess you could say. Why George Jackson matters through the lens of Blood in My Eye. I wrote this back in 2015. So I've been writing for quite a while. And so the picture looks like it's broken for some reason. The link is broken, but this was my take on George Jackson. So I wanted to share this with all of you. And then I'm going to share some quotes because I found a good site for some quotes. And then I want to share with you one interesting thing that I talk about here, where George Jackson, when he was assassinated, they threw his corpse back into his prison cell, right? So they assassinated him in the prison yard in a so-called, they say he was attempting to escape. George Jackson was always organizing, so I don't doubt that could be the case. But he was gunned down in the prison yard and then thrown back in his cell on top of 99 books. And so that's how committed he was to the revolution, holding that many books in a very tiny cell. He was in solitary confinement for the vast majority of his tenure, so no more than 10 feet long or wide, right? None of his cells were that large. So I said right before I left college, I wrote an essay on the political relationship between George Lester Jackson and the first revolutionary president of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh. The paper compared the works of the two to prove that the language of revolution is global and that solidarity against imperialism extends continents. George Jackson spent 10 years behind prison walls from 1961 to 71. During this period, Jackson became a revolutionary warrior for Black liberation and socialist revolution. Black August has given way to September, not yet, but it is giving way to September now. And George Jackson's life matters now more than ever as a struggle against imperialism marches on. Jackson was a Black American from Chicago originally, but his rebellious spirit and run-ins with police compelled his parents to move to the West Coast. Soon after moving, Jackson was charged for robbing a gas station in Los Angeles, California. Despite evidence of his innocence, the court encouraged Jackson to take a plea deal. The court rewarded Jackson with an indeterminate sentence of 1 year to life. But what transpired after was the ruling system's worst nightmare. Jackson became a committed revolutionary and student of the ideas of Marx, Lenin, Mao, and Black revolutionaries from Malcolm X to Kwame Nkrumah. He practiced these revolutionary ideas by organizing Chicano, white, and Black prisoners against the repression and exploitation experienced behind prison walls. What made George Jackson a threat to the imperialist establishment was his ability to organize prisoners for the revolutionary cause. His seminal manifesto, Blood in My Eye, is both a theoretical analysis of the ruling imperialist system and a strategy for liberation from a Black communist perspective. Jackson's revolutionary transformation came with consequences. He spent 7 of his 10 years in prison in solitary confinement, which included extensive time in the infamous quote-unquote O wing of San Quentin, where prisoners were forced to sleep and eat in their own filth for 23 and a half hours per day. So this is still a practice, everyone. Julian Assange is going through it, okay? Julian Assange is going through solitary confinement. This is the common practice. And in the United States, if he were to come to the United States, he would undoubtedly face these very similar conditions. Remember that. Mumia Abu-Jamal and others continue to experience these things. And solitary confinement is torture. More than 2 weeks now. It's the UN Special Rapporteur said it is torture. All right. So George Jackson was tortured in this O wing of solitary confinement. But yet he was a revolutionary, maintained that throughout his imprisonment. While in prison, Jackson was sentenced to death in 1970 after the state framed him for the murder of a prison guard. This was in supposed retaliation to the prison guard-induced murder of brawling inmates inside of Soledad prison just days prior. Prison officials accused Jackson of retaliation because he was deemed the only one who would do it, quote unquote. Jackson's case received international attention. Revolutionary organizations such as the Black Panther Party came to his defense, and George Jackson would become a member of the Black Panther Party. His case inspired his 17-year-old brother, Jonathan Jackson, to free the Soledad brothers by storming Marin County courtroom and kidnapping the judge and his aides. Jonathan Jackson was killed in the event, but his actions helped strengthen the Black liberation movement by bringing numerous supporters to the growing prison movement. George Jackson placed his murdered brother in the same vein as Che Guevara. Furthermore, Jackson's last word before being assassinated in 1971 were, "The dragon has come," quote unquote. This is a reference to Ho Chi Minh's poem Wordplay, which states, "When the prison gates are open, the real dragon will fly out." These words indicate that Jackson was an internationalist who drew from the global struggle against imperialism for inspiration in the fight against the U.S. ruling class within what he called the quote-unquote American monster. And I don't think that there is anything more apt than that description for the United States. He discredited Black organizations and leaders who attacked socialism as a white idea when Vietnam, Cuba, Algeria, and nations all over the world were fighting for a socialist system. Blood in My Eye is a call to join the world in the war against U.S. imperialism, and it builds on Malcolm X's belief that revolution in the U.S. is dependent upon solidarity and support from the world's people and vice versa. So George Jackson was an internationalist. He was actively courting this. I remember reading that George Jackson was studying all of the languages he could: Arab, Mandarin, Russian. He was trying to learn Spanish, of course, all the languages he could, Swahili. He was trying to learn all the languages that he could so he could be, despite being in prison and probably never making it out. I don't think he ever had an illusion that he was going to make it out of prison, right? There was a huge Free Huey campaign during this time, but George Jackson wasn't calling or even seeking out a huge Free George Jackson campaign. And I think it's because he knew his days were numbered, just in the ways that he was being treated with the Soledad incident. The U.S. imperialist system George Jackson broke down in Blood in My Eye remains dominant throughout the world, with riper conditions to spread its misery. Black America is in a worse economic state than it was during Jackson's period, and so too is the state of the entire working class. The mass Black incarceration state has since been erected to lock Black Americans away from a capitalist economy that no longer needs their labor, and at the same time represses the potential development of Black revolutionary activity against the state. It was George Jackson who developed a foundational theory of the prison state in relationship to the design of the imperialist system. So to me, George Jackson is the father, the theoretical father of what it means to understand the function of prisons in the United States in its so-called unique but not exceptional, developmental situation. Jackson succinctly summarized the purpose of the mass Black incarceration state in Blood in My Eye as such, quote, "The ultimate expression of law is not order, it's prison. The law and everything that interlocks with it was constructed for poor, desperate people like me," end quote. George Jackson traced the development of the mass Black incarceration state to the U.S. government war on the Black Panther Party, which Jackson joined while in prison. Jackson's analysis was informed by the brutal repression he and the Panthers faced at the high tide of the Black liberation movement. It was also solidified by what he saw from directly behind the walls as the changing character of U.S. prisons into an institution specially made for Black people. The struggle against police brutality in the prison state today has much to learn from Jackson's analysis. So, people will often say, well, there's so many white prisoners in prison. But George Jackson was already seeing the shift in the proportion of Black people in comparison to white people to the rest of the population. And that as the war, the repression against the Black Panther Party, Black Liberation Movement, the American Indian Movement, etc., the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s, as that was happening, he was seeing already behind the wall that there were more and more people being in prison, and it seemed to take on a racial character. And so he was really the first to point that out. I have often drawn from George Jackson in my articles, but no amount of brief citation or singular articles can do his contributions justice. His internationalism is critical in this period of never-ending war waged all over the world by U.S. imperialism. He draws on the best of Malcolm X in his sharp critiques of the bankrupt left and Black opportunists that would become the Black misleadership class. His tireless study of history should be emulated by all self-identified freedom fighters. Blood in My Eye, for example, provides a historical materialist analysis of fascism's development in Europe and its application to U.S. imperialist development in the post-World War II era. We must seek to understand this period of history in the same manner that Jackson sought to understand the conditions of his own historical experience. As John Pilger said, study history, study politics. I'm going to get into this with the question. I'm going to try to end this stream with a question from a subscriber, because I think this gets into what my answer would be. So, but perhaps the greatest gift Jackson gave to the struggle for liberation was his deep knowledge of strategy and organization. Throughout Blood in My Eye, one can find entire sections dedicated to urban guerrilla warfare and political organization. Jackson concluded that a revolutionary movement required three elements: an above-ground organization that carries out political work, an independent media, which is what I consider myself, and an underground organization committed to creating the crises for the establishment. He further emphasized the necessity of ideology and demands. According to Jackson, without either, those attracted to the struggle for justice will merely become Americans again after each demonstration, protest, or political activity. For Jackson, the revolutionary task was to develop soldiers for freedom, while quote-unquote Americans at any given moment are subject to performing duties as soldiers for the empire. Jackson's organizational skills and revolutionary ideology inspired an insurgent prison movement in the 60s and 70s. When Jackson was murdered, Attica prisoners fasted in tribute to his life. A week later, they waged a heroic rebellion for dignity behind the walls and were subsequently massacred by the state. This is popularly known as Attica Rebellion. That was then, this is now. Most who reside in the U.S. have never heard of George Jackson, and his work has been repressed by imperialism along with the ideas that he represented. Now, I want to tell you that George Jackson, his books are still banned in prisons. Oftentimes, his books will get people solitary confinement. They will be punished in that way. And we know that prisons have been doing more book banning, right, over the course of the last several years. And that began really under the Obama era. Current conditions within the U.S. certainly reflect much of what Jackson wrote in his essay After the Revolution Has Failed. In this chapter, Jackson concludes that a combination of reform and repression set back the revolutionary struggle against imperialism. His analysis remains important today. Rapid technological changes, austerity, mass surveillance, and the institution of a quote-unquote volunteer army have taken their toll on people's consciousness. These are but a few changes that arose in concert with the growth of a labor and blackness leadership class to blunt the revolutionary consciousness of oppressed classes in the U.S. As developments such as Black Lives Matter continue to form an identity under the conditions of 21st century imperialism, a return to the works of George Jackson offers a critical lesson on the importance of political consciousness in the fight for a new world. As Jackson noted, we are faced with the task of raising a positive mobilization for revolutionary consciousness in a mass that has gone through a contrapositive authoritarian process. So, I mean, he was one of the few that was talking about how current conditions that we face, and I feel like all of this is still very relevant, current conditions that we face are influenced by this process of reform and repression, and that is a big part of fascism. And he wholly believed that the U.S. was a fascist country now, and this was in the 60s and 70s, early, 60s, late 60s, and then he died, killed in the early 70s. But this is important. I want to show you. His corpse was thrown on top of 99 books that resided in his cell directly after the murder, as assassination. I want to show you what books he was reading. All right, I got the document up. It's online. You can find it. I could send the PDF in the chat afterward. But here you go. This was the warden of San Quentin Prison filing the books that were in the cell of George Jackson. And it's hard to read, so some of these might be hard to read on a computer screen. But, Herbert Aptheker, To Be Free. He was reading C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon. He was reading all sorts of books. Frederick Engels, Karl Marx, right? He was reading the Marxist philosophy readers of Marx, Lenin, and Engels. A lot of Herbert Aptheker, Martin Luther King Jr., these are 99 books in his cell. Philip Foner, the historian, just down the line, more Engels. I know there's Ho Chi Minh in here. So I'm not going to go over all the books. You see Kwame Nkrumah, right? You have his own book here. Soledad Brother had a copy of his own book. He had W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. He had a lot of Du Bois in there. Selections of Karl Marx on the women question, Frederick Engels, V.I. Lenin, Stalin. So he's reading revolutionaries from all across the world, learning from them. He had Capital, right, from Karl Marx. He was reading about the history of imperialism and capitalism, the theory of imperialism and capitalism. That's what he was doing. Eldridge Cleaver's book, more Herbert Aptheker, more Lenin, right? But that's 99 books. that were found in his cell. And I'm just going to put that quickly in the chat. So the PDF is in the chat. This would make a great study guide for anyone who wants to know history. Of course, there's other things that could be added to this because this was, 1971, September. So, of course, things have been written since then. But in terms of history, theory, he was doing it. And so that's what made him a threat, because he brought that to the masses. He did that. He brought that to the masses. So let's just close up this article. And then I think I'm going to get to a Patreon question, a subscriber question. All right. So George Jackson corpse was thrown on 99 books that resided in his cell after his assassination. His deep knowledge of history and theory helped him pioneer the first theoretical framework of the mass black incarceration state and he made critical contributions to a revolutionary analysis of guerrilla warfare and political organization. And the work that I find most important is the work he did to build unity among the oppressed and clarity on the character of the oppressor state. Although much has changed since his death and revolution seems remote, imperialism is currently in its most vulnerable stage. Global forces are truly moving away. I was saying this in 2015. All right. I've been saying this for a while. Global forces are moving away from imperialist hegemony, and capitalism's periodic crises have become more acute. We must introduce revolutionaries such as George Jackson in any conversation about building a radical movement in this time so that more like him can develop. George Jackson's life truly matters. So I'll put this in the chat as well for you guys. But that's my piece on George Jackson. I wanted to give him his just coverage because he was so important to me. He still is. I mean, his work still informs what I do. It informs my focus on imperialism, right? His idea that we needed an independent media, right, that doesn't capitulate. And there's a lot of capitulation going around right now, a lot of it, right? So as I get to the next thing I want to cover, I was going to show you some quotes, but maybe I'll just put that in the chat because I want to get to a subscriber question, okay? Before I depart from you all. So it's Loa Socialisti had a good question. I just need to find it on Patreon because it's a good one. And I think it has to do with a lot of things that are happening. I'm not commenting on a lot of things in regard to this question. And it has to do with how communists or self-described communists of a certain tradition, the Fourth Internationalist tradition, how they talk about socialist countries, okay? And so this is a really good question. I'm going to pull it up once I find the post. I need to re-up the post for subscriber questions. Apologies that I have not done that yet. So I'm going to pull this up, okay? Let me share the screen. So, this is one of the things I do for subscribers on Patreon, okay, is I am taking their questions and answering them in streams, usually at the end for everyone, okay? So here we go. So I'm going to my Patreon, all right? So here it is, the exclusive Patreon subscribers live stream Q&A. I need to re-up this post. It's from all the way August 6th. And so here's the question from a routine watcher and much appreciated subscriber. Loa Socialisti says, hey, Danny, can you speak to the Bolsheviks' tendency for a rebirth of the Fourth International views on China, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea's deformed worker state, i.e. state-owned economies not under the thumb of capitalist rule, but falling short of workers' control of industry? So then with, lots of context here given, thank yous for this, with all of the aggression, it seems the collective left is struggling to navigate how to demonstrate solidarity with the Communist Party of China against imperialist aggression, but also fighting for more than just achieving socialism in one country. China's made commendable gains and all that has been achieved. Some on the left still see China as countries with imperialist ambitions and Russia that seem to succumb to following for some manifestation of Cold War propaganda. How can the left balance a fair critique of China and other deformed worker state, quote unquote, bloc to work towards the goals of global socialist revolution, Bolshevism, and also commending the Chinese government for their rapid growth and success for improving the lives of people in their country amidst neocolonial and imperialist pillage by Western aggressive forces? I mean, this is a great question, right? This is the Fourth International politics talking, and I've never been a fan, right? From the ISO to all sorts of tendencies, right? There's so many tendencies within the Fourth International. I'm not going to name them all. But this is a problem I've encountered ever since. And I'm just gonna close up the Patreon question. This is a question that I have been dealing with since I started to study socialism and communism back in 2011, 10, 11. A really troublesome thing. Actually, in Occupy Wall Street, these were the forces I first met, right? And was first introduced to people outside of my own independent study handing me literature, right? Saying, hey, read us, right? Read the Spartacus, read ISO, right? They were the ones saying, read us. They were always at demonstrations, and they espoused by this analysis of it actually existing socialist countries. And so I want to comment on two phenomena. So there's this deformed worker state, anti-communist orientation. And then now what I'm seeing online, at least, is a real debate about patriotism and how patriotism is reflected in actually existing socialist countries. So you have people defending socialist countries and saying, well, we should all be American patriots because socialist countries like China and Vietnam are patriotic. So I want to address that because they're all related. These are all what I would call distortions of materialism, of dialectical materialism, historical materialism. So the first distortion, this distortion of an understanding of socialism, right, is pure dogma. So deformed worker state is, to me, has an incredible tinge of racism. Now, what the Fourth International says is that everything up until Lenin's death is socialism, right? So the Soviet Union, for all the way up into the early 1920s, was a socialist country. And then after Lenin died, and then the Stalin period occurred, and this gives me the idea. I want to get Lady Ildizar here, if I'm saying her name right, Ildizar. Her work on the Soviet Union is great. She's been on the Deprogram podcast. I follow her YouTube channel. I really want her to talk about the Soviet Union because this is a popular understanding among Fourth Internationalists, many of them being kind of like white-led, I would say, organizations. They have this idea that this deformed worker state happened in the Soviet Union and then everywhere else, right? So every other country that went the way of socialism is deformed because it doesn't have their definition of socialism, which is Soviet councils, right? Workers' councils, and they say direct worker control of the means of production. Now, to me, all of this itself is a complete misunderstanding of what socialism is in the Marxist sense. Socialism in the Marxist sense is not 100% worker control over production. That cannot be achieved under actually existing conditions that we live under. You cannot just give workers, right? You can't just form workers' councils and say they're going to control everything. Marx is very clear in the critique of the Gotha program, and Lenin is very clear in State and Revolution, that socialism is actually a dictatorship of the proletariat. In that dictatorship of the proletariat, you will have many various ways in which the proletariat exercise that dictatorship. It can't always be direct control. And why is that? Well, workers are generally closest to the means of production, but workers are generally not closest to managing them, if that makes sense, right? The idea that people now are just going to erase and eliminate class contradictions under socialism is folly and really just akin to ultra-leftism, which says, no, we're just in the communist stage now. People are just controlling the means of production without classes. No, you have a need to, especially in underdeveloped colonial context, you have a need to develop the capacity of workers to be able to wrestle hold of the means of production and be able to administer them and advance them. So workers' councils are just one way that happens. But the principal way is through control of the state machinery and a complete revolutionizing of the policies of that state machinery in the benefit of working people to advance their technological, educational, and overall well-being, right? That is the goal. So if that's the goal, right, a dictatorship of the proletariat that does those things, then is China socialist? Absolutely, because China has achieved all of that and has many different mechanisms for both popular administration and control, and also has does have institutions for workers control and production, but also with an understanding that in order to advance the productive forces, you need central planning, high level of central planning, and also the flexibility to allow capitalist market mechanisms, right? The capitalist market to exist in some highly regulated form so that you can also advance technologically. So this is why contradictions under socialism continue to exist. It doesn't make them not socialist, right? China's ability to regulate the market and to open up to capitalism in ways that the Soviet Union could not do does not mean that there isn't a dictatorship of the proletariat there. Because if there wasn't a dictatorship of the proletariat or of the peasants and the rest of the classes, right, that were exploited by imperialism and capitalism and feudalism there, then we would have a different situation. We wouldn't see the technological advancement, the educational advancement, and also the standard of living of all people in China go up the way that it has. We wouldn't have poverty eradication. We wouldn't have China leading the world and all of these different things. And you wouldn't have a governance system that is increasing its legitimacy. You wouldn't have Chinese people themselves saying, yes, we do get to vote for our township and local delegates, right? Deputies. And then those deputies, right, in direct democracy kind of structure, get to vote for the next level, municipal, provincial, all the way up to the National Assembly. You wouldn't have that trust in the government, in that kind of government, to get things done. So socialism, right? This shouldn't be derogatory to understand. Socialism in these conditions, under world imperialism, under US hegemony, under very delicate conditions, and under conditions where those pursuing socialism are poorer generally than Western capitalist so-called advanced countries, colonial countries, that these countries need to take whatever possible means necessary to advance the productive forces and to ensure that the livelihoods of the people are met, and that this corresponds with an overall dictatorship of the masses of people, of the workers, of the peasants, of the oppressed classes. So it's always been dogma for Fourth Internationalists or any socialist to say, well, you're not socialist unless you correspond with this narrow understanding of what the Soviet Union was like in the first experiment of socialism for the first 5 to 7 to 8 years, that is the definition. Even the Soviet Union had to reform in the wake of in the wreckage of World War I, the invasion of 17 imperialist capitalist countries right after in 1918, the Soviet Union had to reform itself. It instituted the new economic policy, which was about increasing the productive forces and easing some of the policies that would disrupt unity and disrupt economic development. And it worked really well. And it worked all the way up into the period under the Stalin era, where there were then other changes, and then of course World War II happened not too long after that. So, once we were in the mid 30s, we're in the Second World War. For the Soviet Union, of course, the Second World War started a lot sooner than it did for the United States. So it's dogma to claim that socialism doesn't exist. It's deformed too. But I mean, in terms of fair criticisms, right? I think that No criticism of an actually existing country, socialist country, can occur unless we address the fact that imperialism is setting the conditions by which socialist countries can navigate and develop. So if you want to talk about Nicaragua still being poor, still having difficulties, right, meeting certain markers, advancing economically, you have to talk about those brutal sanctions on Nicaragua from the United States. If you want to talk about China having censorship um, of private social media from the West, you need to talk about how private social media from the West, from who many free speechers love, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, said and proved that actually these intelligence forces behind the social media companies that are directly working with social media corporations in the West are infiltrating data, taking data from China, and that was proven, right? So unless you talk about the DPRK, you're not happy about the DPRK nuclearizing? Well, the United States is occupying South Korea, constantly threatening nuclear war, and is still technically at war with the DPRK. Only an armistice was signed in 1953. And if you don't know anything about history, then you don't know about how Korea was leveled and destroyed, especially the northernmost, Pyongyang, and the northern part of Korea was leveled by the United States, right? More than 30% of the population was rendered homeless, 70+% of all buildings destroyed, and biological warfare was used, on and on and on. Nuclear weapons were threatened. So, and they were used not too long before in Japan during World War II. So if we're going to criticize actually existing socialist countries for navigating, and this is what I hate about, because criticism can often be another word for just subjective opinions. So if you want to have a subjective opinion about socialist countries like the DPRK or China, without objectively analyzing the conditions by which these countries are navigating and developing socialism, then your subjective opinions just don't matter, right? And maybe you shouldn't even express them, not because you don't have the right to express them, but because they're not helpful, right? George Jackson said it really wisely in Blood in My Eye. He says, not all opinions really matter. They don't. And so if your opinion doesn't matter, it's not going to affect anything positive for socialism, then it's not an opinion that we need, right? You can have that opinion, you can hold it dear to your heart and be a good American and be individualistic and hug it every day and do affirmations with your criticisms about socialism. But I don't care. But like it's not going to help the progress that we need to make. And I think that China wouldn't even say, the Communist Party of China wouldn't even say, they consider themselves in the primary stage of socialism, meaning step number one. So if China believes itself to be in the primary stage of socialism, then obviously China is looking into economic reforms, political reforms. It's fast changing. Vietnam, right, had the Doi Moi, same deal, right? Constantly looking to reform and change so that socialism is approved upon and takes into account both external and internal conditions. That's what we should be looking at. And we should be doing it objectively. And of course, our main mission, I think, our main goal should be defending socialist countries. We have to defend them. That's our role here in the imperialist epicenter, in the citadel of imperialism. And, I think that that's what we have to really focus on the most. And so the balance for me is with this critique that the Fourth International has and some ultra left, you could say, communist elements in the West and the United States, is to build a stronger pole, organized pole in terms of media, in terms of organization, that has at its core the defense of these countries for genuine objective reasons, while leaving the subjective and internal struggle of these countries to those peoples and nations, to them. That is self-determination. And once we do that and things go wrong, then we can surely criticize, because then we're involved in that struggle too. Then we have a stake in it too. But if you're going to sit on the outside, and say, oh, that's a deformed worker state, we can't support it, then you're just an imperialist, because you don't have, not only do you not have an analysis of socialism that means a damn thing, that has any kind of significance, but you're de facto going along with the ideological line of the empire, which is that these countries aren't socialists, that they're just nuisances and they all destroy and kill and oppress their own people. Get rid of them. That's what that line essentially amounts to. And now I want to close with the other side that has happened. Now there's an online movement that says that it's, for it defends socialist countries. And I applaud anybody. If you're in agreement with me to defend China, Cuba, DPRK, anyone from imperialism, then I'm with you. And I'll always stand with you on that. But there are some who have taken this idea that these countries have patriotism, which they do. DPRK, Vietnam, Cuba, China, Laos. You can go on and on and on, right? With countries, Nicaragua, they have patriotism. They have great pride in the national development of their countries, and they should. There's a lot of good reasons for that. And the biggest reason that is often not spoken about is that these countries have histories of imperialist and foreign domination. Imperialism and foreign domination. Colonialism, semi-colonialism, semi-feudalism, right? An international world system of imperialism has terrorized these countries and put them in the situation of having to build socialism from a very low point of development. So to be able to get past that, to forge real independence, not nominal independence, but independence economically, politically, and militarily, is a huge deal. And so I would salute that too if I lived in that situation. But it's not the same as American patriotism. It's not. We can't belie reality. It's not the same, right? The history of the United States is not the same. The American Revolution is not the Chinese Revolution. The American Revolution actually helped cement and strengthen chattel slavery, capitalism, and colonialism to a degree greater than prior, right? That's just the facts. Gerald Horne has documented this. This is the facts of the situation. American patriotism has not ever been at the center, even if it has been a part of, right? Like you could say the CPUSA had moments, even in their thriving period, right? Even during the Second World War, you could say Paul Robeson, you could say all these had elements of patriotism in them, right? Appealing to the masses, because Americanism was very high at that time. You could say that that was an element, but there's never been a political movement in the United States that's progressive or revolutionary that was driven by patriotism, unlike in China and Cuba, where national liberation was indeed a driving force. We are not liberating the United States from what? The United States? Like, we need to be more concrete and specific. The principal contradiction in the United States is class, it's white supremacy, it's empire. It's not whether we're not liberating the nation. We're not. There are many oppressed nations in the United States, right? Indigenous nations, Black people, right? Those indigenous to Mexico, right? We can go on and on and on. There are many oppressed nations in the United States. We're not rallying behind a flag that has no political content or basis in socialist struggle. It doesn't make any sense, right? And now there's the question of, well, what do you do about those people who have pride in that flag? I think we need to do what political activists, journalists, analysts, people interested in revolution do, which is you start where people are, you work with people around issues that you are united on, and then you have real ideological conversations. You have ideological conversations with people that may disagree with you on some things. That's what you do. And you try to win them over to your organization, to your movement. And I think it's so interesting, this idea about patriotism, because, movements are not fueled by ideology, right? Even though the Chinese Revolution was fueled by patriotism, that wasn't what the Red Army, that was what the People's Liberation Army was fighting for. They weren't fighting for a new flag. They were fighting for everything that flag would represent, right? It would represent the liberation of the peasants from feudalism and semi-colonialism. It would represent the eradication of imperialist subversion. It would represent the ability to eradicate and alleviate poverty, raise the standard of living of the people, right? What Mao said, China has stood up. It's a new China. So this whole idea about a flag and about being a patriot, and a polls that say, oh well, people have patriotic sentiments. Polls can say a whole lot of things, but they don't necessarily reflect the actual reality of our movements are not driven by sentiment. They're driven by real material things. So a bunch of workers, sure, all of them may say, yeah, I'm not going to spit on the flag. All right, well, we're not going to spit on the flag with them. We're going to fight for better wages, for a union, for maybe even taking over the company and running it ourselves. We're not going to fight for the flag as it already is represented. We're going to fight for something concrete and material. And then our ideology is going to be reflective of that. We're going to fight against these endless wars. We're going to fight against U.S. imperialism, this endless expansion of the military budget. We're going to fight against a mass incarceration state, against racist policing. We're going to fight all of these things. And then we're also going to have ideological conversations. And it's for damn sure that they're likely not going to, unless you want them to and you're trying to, divert into some kind of conversation about the value of the American flag. That's a high-level ideological debate, which is very much detached from movement politics. The American flag represents what was established in 1776 and then 1783, which is the United States. And what is the United States? It's a capitalist, imperialist, and colonial country. That's its origins. And the vast majority of any political movement that has espoused that flag has either been heavily compromised by nationalistic, chauvinistic sentiment, or has literally been forces seeking to impose nationalistic and chauvinistic sentiment. This is the history of the United States, and we have to be true to that. So no, Cuban patriotism, DPRK, patriotism in Korea, patriotism in China, in Vietnam is not the same as the United States. It's not the same content. It's not. You can't say, there's nothing proving that. You know, if it's for you, if you feel like that's a subjective opinion. If it is for you and you feel that way, that's great. Then you've got to build a movement built around American patriotism as defined as socialism. And you have to test that out in the world, not just in social media, not just, on streams. That you have to go test that out. I'm not going to stop you from testing it out. This is not about me trying to cancel or whatever. This is just a disagreement. And it's one that I think is rooted in years of experience, So I think that's the other side of this is, right, we should continue to unite around things that we agree on, continue to talk about and defend socialist countries, defend the integrity of socialism from people like Fourth Internationalists. But we can't go to this other place. It's very popular now, right? To go to this other place. Well, make America great again, and American exceptionalism is on high, and it's all over the media, and it's, of course, social media is going to help fuel it. As John Pilger said, these are U.S. corporations fueling this sentiment, and so we're going to then make these gross distortions out of it. We're going to create what are just ideological inconsistencies, which is this idea that somehow you can export you can export and compare American patriotism to the patriotism of socialist countries. I'm sorry, it's like a complete reversal of the actual history, right? Nothing about American patriotism symbolizes national liberation. It doesn't. Most national liberations in movements that happened in the United States, Black liberation, American Indian movement, etc., they weren't holding up that flag as something that they were necessarily proud of. I'm talking about the movements, not straw manning like individuals who at one time, right, like Paul Robeson. No, we're talking about the entire movement, right? We're talking about organizations like the UNIA, like even the Communist Party of the United States, like like the Black Panther Party, like the American Indian Movement, AIM. We're talking about these were national liberation movements, the CP less so. The CP had a different kind of line that was both positive and, had its drawbacks. As we all know, the CP has had its own kind of history, just like any other organization. So, we have to be very sober in this analysis that national liberation movements in the United States have not upheld this. So if you want to be really specific about this, then I think it's important, So that's my opinion on that, right? That I think there's a connection here because all of this is distortions of socialism and distortions of ideology around socialism. So deformed worker state versus, Korea, China, Cuba being so patriotic that it's the same as American patriotism. It's all attempts to revise socialist ideology to meet what I think are kind of personal endeavors that are about endeavors that don't have much basis, if any at all, in movement politics. Because I haven't seen it. I've been in unions, anti-war organizations, communist organizations. I have not seen this be a core part of what people are concerned about, right? People are not concerned about whether they're going to eat patriotism or be housed in patriotism or get peace from patriotism. They're generally not concerned about that. Ending racism with patriotism. I'm interested in how do we fight, cover, understand, and analyze the existing imperialist system so that our ideology, in our ideological debates, our conversations, and the ways in which the ideology is expressed and led by a movement, transpires. That's what I'm interested in, developing that synthesis between our actions, our words, and our deeds. That's what I'm most interested in. And that's how we build socialism, is synthesizing those two together, helping educate, agitate, and organize people into socialism, into a socialist movement, into anti-imperialism. Because usually anti-imperialism has to go along with socialism. You can't really separate the two. So anyway, that's my opinion on that question. We're hitting into the 2-hour mark now. With that said, everyone, I think I'm going to end there. Okay. There's a lot of, I see spam here. And I want to ask, just lastly, before you leave, of course, you're hitting, liking the video if you haven't. The ratio is incredible. So thanks so much. And the biggest thing, though, is support, right? So got some updates to make, got some things I need to do. And we're coming up at the end of the month, and usually that's the toughest time for us so-called content creators. So patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong is the best place to support this work. Patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. Looking for about $30 per month to stave off the storm of the end of the month and be able to start moving on some things as well. So please do support if you're able to. There's more options in the description of the video. And with that said, everyone, I am going to head out. I should be back probably without a guest either tomorrow or the next day. Oops, sorry. With that said, though, then I will be going on maybe an extended break. I'll try. I don't know if I'm going to be going on vacation. I might try to bring my headset. I'll have my laptop. So maybe I can do some kind of like fun kind of subscriber only stuff, or even just like public subscriber only streams if I have the opportunity, but I may not. All right. And that would be a good 9 days. So bringing this equipment anywhere is like, woo. But I will be around. And so, the next 3 days I'll be doing some stuff out here. And yeah, so thank you so much for coming today. And I will see you all again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.